Okay, awesome. Hey, wealth builders. Simon Dixon here. I'm just going to change my glasses to the Bitcoin Hard Talk glasses. And this is episode 14 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. This is where we talk about hard money. I've been dedicating 20 years of my life now. I'm feeling old to Bitcoin investing and money. Obviously, Bitcoin only came around approximately 15 years ago as a result of the financial crisis. But I was talking about banking and monetary reform and geopolitics. And then when Bitcoin came along, we discovered that you could actually exit the traditional system. So ever since then, I've been helping people navigate how to adjust to a Bitcoin and central bank digital currency world. Central bank digital currencies are going to be built upon the proof of weapons network, and Bitcoin is built upon the proof of work network. If you don't know what that is, welcome to the show. This is educational. In the first half, we're going to be discussing all the news around Bitcoin breaking 43K and what that means in the context of the general Bitcoin cycles that I've been covering ever since. I've been through all of the cycles now, ever since I first bought my first Bitcoin at $3. Seems like a lifetime, and the world has changed, certainly. In the second half, we're going to be covering actually a topic that from an old blog that I wrote in 2000, even before Bitcoin, I got involved in Bitcoin, 2009, I think it was, where I was discussing the flows of money in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and how that relates to the geopolitics of today. So we're going to be dusting off an old blog because we're going to be answering the question, where does the money come from that the economic hitmen at the IMF use in order to enslave the world with the proof of weapons, US dollar network debt? We're going to be answering that today, and it's hugely relevant as we move and transition into wartime economics that we've covered in previous episodes. So let's jump straight in with the first half. So Bitcoin broke through 43K. Every single time that Bitcoin breaks into a new cycle at the end, approaching the halving cycle. Remember, in previous episodes, we've talked about the monetary policy that no government and no central bank in the world can change, influence, control, and that is Bitcoin's monetary policy. Every 4 years, the number of Bitcoins mined and rewarded to miners halves. So they get new Bitcoins every 10 minutes, and eventually all 21 million Bitcoins will be created. That creates a digital gold without the ability to mine and find new gold. So you can plan right into the future for generations ahead of you, and you can calculate exactly what the money supply will be. That introduces hard money back into the world. We used to have hard money called gold, and then the Fiat Currency proof of weapons network diluted the shit out of it, and we all ended up in debt slavery because banks create money every time they issue a loan, and we end up in an economy where you have more debt than money actually exists. And so you have to find a new market for your debt, which is individuals, student loans, credit cards. Then you have to look to companies, then you have to look to the government. And when that all rolls over and collapses in a Ponzi scheme, you look to the central bank and eventually central bank digital currencies as we transition to communism on a blockchain called a central bank digital currency. It's inevitable, it's predictable, it's guaranteed. So rather than fight it, you might as well go with it, which is why we prepare you for a Bitcoin and central bank digital currency world. Bitcoin allows you to exit. So it hit 43K. Why is that happening? Well, it is at the end of the 4-year cycle. In April next year, in April 2024, we have the next halving event. And this halving cycle was an absolute roller coaster. The all-time high of Bitcoin is approximately $68,000. And in that 4-year cycle, you tend to get a cycle of downward spiraling, which if you're a Bitcoin thinker is a good thing. We love Bitcoin crashes if you've been studying my content for a while, because that allows you to earn more fiat currency from the proof of weapons network and purchase more Bitcoin at a cheaper rate in the proof of work network. The proof of work network is got the monetary policy that is inevitable, predictable, guaranteed to be the same into the future because it's backed by the largest, most decentralized network of computers that has ever existed in humankind. You have to blow them all up all around the world, and even then they would just relocate because it is a time highs. But remember, the previous high of Bitcoin was approximately $68,000, but adjusted for inflation and interest rates, we have to get to 78K if you are thinking in the fiat world. And in the Bitcoin world, we don't care. The lower the price, the more Bitcoin you get to accumulate every month. The higher it goes, the more you get to feel wealthy in the proof of weapons network. But the proof of weapons network, called US dollars and fiat currencies like pounds and euros, is fake because you have to spend them as fast as possible and you have to go deep and deep into debt. And the closer you are to the central bank through the Cantillon effect, the cheaper the interest rate you get. And so we have a massive redistribution from those that are not on the right side of the central bank to those that are and can borrow money at the cheapest rates, which is the banks, because they get to create money every time they issue a loan. And you have to borrow in order to feed the monster. That ends up the banks benefiting from the cheap interest rate and you paying the high interest rate. And if you're really far down the cycle, you put it all on credit cards, and those credit cards charge the highest interest rate, and the bank gets the cheapest interest rate because they're next to the central banks. And then all the small banks, they go bust, as we saw this year in 2023, and you have to roll them all over into those that invented the fiat currency proof of weapon network, which is the JP Morgans and the larger banks of this world that got themselves positioned. But eventually it all implodes because eventually all the money is in the hands of the wealthy, nothing is in the hands of everyone else, and they got no one to sell their shit to, which we'll cover more in the IMF side and how that rolls over the cycle. Okay, so what did we see in cycle 4? So we're about in our 15th year in Bitcoin. In cycle 4, it was an absolute roller coaster that brought us to 43K. So this year, pensioners, thanks to the Securities and Exchange Commission, in January are highly likely to be able to protect themselves from the proof of weapons network. So rather than having traditional stocks and bonds to try and protect themselves from the melting ice cube called fiat currency, they actually get to buy Bitcoin through an exchange-traded fund in a tax-deferred way. So by having an exchange-traded funds, which are set to launch in January next year, that means that it's going to be backed by Bitcoin. So the largest pockets of money in the world, they have to buy Bitcoin to back their new exchange-traded funds. All of the pension fund managers, they get to put it in their pensions to protect themselves from the proof of weapons network. And therefore, it has to be backed by that Bitcoin, which creates demand supply going into 2024 halving cycle, where the supply contracts. So you get increased demand, contracting supply, economics 101, it repeats itself. And yet everyone goes along in each cycle and says, Bitcoin's dead, Bitcoin's over, Bitcoin's a scam, Bitcoin's a Ponzi, keep saying that. And it creates this isometric arbitrage opportunity for those that understand the proof of work network from those that don't understand it yet and are still playing in the proof of weapons network. It's beautiful. It's Satoshi Nakamoto. It was a gift to the world. No one knows who Satoshi is, but it felt like a divine intervention that allowed us to eat the fiat currency proof of weapon network with the peaceful proof of work Bitcoin network. Bitcoin, not bombs. So in cycle 4, what did we have? Well, remember I created the video series in early 2020 called The Great Depression of the 2020s from a video I released in 2009, where I was discussing the Great Depression of the 2020s by plotting out the fiat currency cycles. And we got the Great Depression of the 2020s, but is being diluted by central bank intervention. So we started with a pandemic. Bitcoin has never lived through a pandemic, but it survived it. We also had quantitative tightening. Bitcoin was always in an environment of low interest rates and excessive money printing ever since it was created from the 2008 financial crisis. So we had to test whether Bitcoin could survive quantitative tightening and inflation. It survived, it smashed the shit out of inflation. It beat every asset class as usual. And these are the same people that 4 years ago, when I was giving videos, they were saying it's too late. I've missed the boat. I'm going to go invest in some shit coins and various other things. And then they end up losing all their money over trading, creating taxable events. And meanwhile, look at the companies that did this the right way. Michael Saylor will go through MicroStrategy in a bit. We also survived the fiat currency bank run crisis. So what happened in fiat currency in 2023? They blew up the banking system through these increased interest rates by blowing up their financial weapons of mass destruction that fund all the wars, called treasuries. And treasuries is the largest debt market in the world. It's where the government borrows all of its proof of weapons network money in order to fund wars. And it blew up the banking system by putting up those interest rates, showing how fragile it is. FDIC, the insurance in the US, only covers 1% of deposits. They have to create a new product, a new tool. We have tools. We see it from the Fed and the chairman. The new tool was a new tool to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme and backstop the entire financial system while JP Morgan comes in and buys up the distressed banks and consolidates them into the proof of weapons network money creation machine that's closest to the central bank. What else did we have? We had that. We also had a crypto leverage crisis. I was involved in a scam as well that took up about 2 years of my life, trying to help 650,000 creditors, one of the largest ones being me, because I was experimenting with doing a bad activity, which was borrowing against my Bitcoin. I make mistakes too, and I share those mistakes when I make them. When greed takes over, what did I do? I didn't want to sell my Bitcoin, so I borrowed against my Bitcoin instead, ended up with a small percentage of my Bitcoin in a scam, and spent 2 years trying to solve that with the other 650,000 people. The gentleman that created that, or I don't think we can call him a gentleman, that's my Britishness coming out. Well, he's a scammer, a crook, and he's going to prison next year. But anyway, we had the crypto leverage crisis. We had scammers and criminals like SBF and Alex Mizhinsky blow up the whole system, and everyone got scammed out of their Bitcoin. Many pensioners were put into that scheme. And so hopefully we'll be able to create a proof of work network from those assets and try and support creditors in recovering some of those funds. Lessons learned. If you're one of those people, make sure you learn and rebuild. And that's what the time is now, to rebuild. So we had the breakdown of the crypto leverage market. We also had the biggest regulatory crackdown you've seen. The largest companies, whether it be Binance, whether it be the reputable ones like Coinbase, for some of the companies we funded at Bank to the Future in the early days, massive regulatory crackdown so that they could make way for the TradFi players when the largest financial institutions in the world are now in the Bitcoin market. Now they're telling us the narratives that we were sharing years and years ago. As the market cap goes through $1 trillion and beyond, there's a $12 trillion gold market cap. There's still plenty of growth to go as the world realizes that digital hard sound money is the product that the future will be using in order to protect themselves from the proof of weapons network. We had that big regulatory crackdown. We also had the big boogeyman that everyone's been talking about, the ban. What happens when governments ban Bitcoin? It gets stronger, baby. China banned Bitcoin, Bitcoin exchanges, Bitcoin mining, and they ended up re-enabling it anyway. They've been flip-flopping ever since 2013. They saw it as a speculative attack on the proof of dollar network, on the proof of weapons dollar network in 2013, and decided to back it. Since then, they've gone back and forth, and now a lot of mining has re-emerged in China. But what happened? All of that proof of work mining power ended up in America. So you end up creating an opportunity for another country, and then America comes along and says, we'll tax the shit out of that. Thank you very much. And then they end up going to South America or Africa. And then eventually the cheapest sources of electricity with the most efficient renewable energy end up being able to repurpose this electricity that is given down to us as a natural resource that then can power the exit from the traditional financial system. But China, the largest market for Bitcoin, the one that said it would break it all, it crashed the price of Bitcoin down to $3,000. Boom, it rebounds. It gets stronger and stronger with every speculative attack. We also survived all the massive fraud of FTX, losing $8 billion scammed out of creditors. Majinsky, $3 billion scammed out of creditors. The massive fraud. And then everyone starts realizing that owning your own money, being able to spend your own money, and having a money supply that's backed by maths and code is useful. And you don't want to recreate banking in the Bitcoin and crypto space. Okay, so we had all of that, and yet Bitcoin still followed the 4-year cycle. We expect, and again, not financial advice, I don't care whether it goes up or down. All I do is ensure that I have more Bitcoin every month than the previous month. Who else does that? MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy implemented a Bitcoin strategy. He said, we can borrow against our equity in the public markets, and they end up making more out of Bitcoin appreciation because they were buying all the way down in the cycle. Everyone was telling Michael Saylor, you're an idiot, you should be fired. You shouldn't be in this game. Why are you accumulating Bitcoin? You're meant to be in the software business. He had a vision. He understood the cycle. He educated the world into a bear market in his incredibly articulate way of explaining the true power of Bitcoin, and got onboarded many, many different corporations that want to manage their treasury and protect themselves from the proof of weapons network through proof of work. He has now sat on over $2 billion of gains through Bitcoin savings, which is obliterating what they make through selling software and what they make through holding their treasuries using dollars or lending it to the US government to blow up children in Gaza and everywhere else that they're funding through their proof of weapons network. So MicroStrategy has gone through its first fiat currency obliteration through proof of work currency. Who else did it? Well, President Bekele did it as well. Everyone was saying the Bank of England, look back through all my previous videos on this YouTube channel. I was getting excited when we went over to El Salvador to show them and give a strategy of how to eat up their $26 billion of IMF debt and their proof of weapons debt that happened from decades and decades of crazy civil wars and being run by gangsters that were extorting all of their people out of their money through sheer violence as a result of all these proof of weapon debt that was funded by the IMF. And the IMF ends up funding all of this dollar debt that destroys countries. And you have all sorts of things that we have seen in the Central and South America as a result of the IMF that we'll be covering in part 2. Well, El Salvador said, screw that. Screw the IMF. And they said, if you have a Bitcoin strategy, we will be taking away your ability to borrow from the IMF. And President Bekele, the brave president that he is, said, screw the IMF. And the Bank of England comes out and says, we are concerned for El Salvador. We are concerned that those people in El Salvador might be able to actually save some money rather than borrowing it from the IMF. We have deep concerns at the Bank of England for El Salvador actually exiting the proof of weapons network. And now they are sat on millions of dollars of gains while the entire credit rating system downgraded its debt, crashed its bonds down to, a couple of 70 cents on the dollar. I think it went even further down on it in the end, and implemented a Bitcoin strategy, made it legal tender, and fulfilled the mission that I've been trying to get governments to do since 2013. 2014 was my first attempt was UK, when Boris Johnson laughed me out of the room for giving them a Bitcoin strategy. And then the Bank of England shut down the strategy I tried to do in Isle of Man in 2014. And instead, El Salvador, Bekele did it. And now we have the next wave of presidents that are going to be seeing what happened in El Salvador. And I think there's going to be a bunch of redevelopment that happens in the digital Bitcoin proof of work network. Okay. What else did we see in the proof of work network? We saw the largest Bitcoin mining IPO public offering in history, up 35% on day one trading on where? The Abu Dhabi exchange. So while we've got a lot of Bitcoin mining companies that are very US centric in the US on NASDAQ, we've ended up with our first one on the Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange. And so Middle East are going down into, and they're understanding that they built their power using commodities like oil. They need to diversify from that in the future. Bitcoin mining, reallocating and repurposing some of your sovereign wealth funds to Bitcoin is creating a lot of buy-in pressure. And we have seen, for example, the Qatar president go out and meet with President Bukele to understand what's going down with this Bitcoin stuff. We got the IPO and we started, they're going to be hungry for more IPOs like that. And Middle East are starting to figure out what is their strategy for diversifying away from some of the oil, but through commodities, digital hard sound money that also meets Sharia law. And I created a video once on how I believe that Bitcoin is actually very, the closest thing we have to halal money rather than building Islamic finance on top of interest-based proof of weapons network on top of those banks, which is haram, but there is no alternative. Finally, we get that alternative. And so this is going to be really interesting to watch the growth of Bitcoin in some of those various other countries as well, especially as we see that. What else have we got in my notes? Let me just look through. Right, there was changes, right? Remember what I said. So whenever you move into wartime economics and whenever there is indications that you need to be fearful of certain terrorist attacks, we saw this with the Patriot Act in the US, where you essentially implement unconstitutional abolishment of human rights, and you get those through during times of maximum fear. If you remember my previous videos and my previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk, I talk about wartime economics being used in order to implement draconian laws, and we are starting to already see those hints of that. And what I'm expecting to see next is we already saw a bill pass through. And that bill passed or looking to pass through, whether it gets through or not is another thing. It depends if America believes in its constitution, which they do. And thanks, constitution saves the day many times because many countries don't have these constitutions. It's one of the things that I think England doesn't have that America has, which is the constitution to keep the government on check. But they look to use all sorts of things to implement these laws. What they were trying to do is they were saying, if a stable coin is involved in any type of terrorist financing using the coin, just like they currently use the dollar or the proof of weapons network, almost all of it happens in fiat currencies and through banks. If they use a stable coin, then anybody that also uses that stable coin can be sanctioned, not just the entity that they were looking to sanction. So you can see where they're trying to take this, that every American that uses some type of stable coin, if they want to sanction something, then they can start sanctioning the individuals that actually use it. This is unprecedented levels of intrusion. Why? Getting ready for what they want to do next. You need wartime economics in order to take this where America needs it to go, because when you're at the end of a debt cycle, when you've reached $1 trillion of interest payments on over $33 trillion of debt on a $27 trillion economy, then you need to implement draconian laws in order to roll over the debt cycle into something like a central bank digital currency. What needs to happen? Well, you need digital ID. That's the first step of a central bank digital currency. How do you get digital ID? Well, you make everybody scared for their life, pandemics. You also make them think that there's a boogie monster looking to blow them up. We know what that means. I won't say that word. It will get me banned from YouTube if I say it. I've noticed traffic is going down, certainly because when I use certain words. So I got to be careful of my language. We don't apparently have freedom of speech in certain channels. And also, this reminds me, we've been backing up all of our videos into a brand new membership portal that we launched on simondixon.com called the BitcoinHardTalk membership portal. Just in case we get taken off YouTube, we get censored, and people don't want proof of work, hard money to get out to the world. They want them to be enslaved into the debt-based proof of weapons network, and they want to be scammed into thinking that we all need to blow each other up because we're all in fear for our life in order to roll over the debt-based proof of weapons network. Then at least the membership portal will be alive, and we'll make sure that we can keep that alive so that all the videos are backed up in the future. If you want to get hold of all the archives, this is probably a good time for me to say this, as I'll pull up the screen. Before we transition over to the IMF content and everything, you can go over to simondixon.com. On simondixon.com, you will see a big yellow button, preparing for a Bitcoin and central bank digital currency world. When you click that button, you'll be able to sign up to a newly created Bitcoin HardTalk membership portal. For those of you that signed up on my site before, we'll be moving you all over, and you would have received an email so that you can go over there. And the Bitcoin HardTalk membership portal is where we're archiving all the videos and all the Great Depression of the 2020s. You can catch up with everything that I talk about, and you'll be able to do that. Okay. So the Middle East and the stock markets diversifying into mining. You need these wartime economics in order to implement things like digital IDs. Digital IDs means that everybody can be trace tracked, and then you can code the monetary system when banks go bust, rather than bailing the banks out and everyone rioting in the streets like we saw in 2008. You can go back to some of my archive videos where I was presenting on banking reform at the Occupy London presentations and various other things. Rather than doing that, they'll just replace the bank with a central bank digital currency. You'll need a digital ID in order to get your deposit back. And then the issuance of central bank digital currency rolls through, and that is non-debt-based money in order to deleverage a debt-based economy in a world where banks create money. This is why central bank digital currencies are incredibly disruptive to the banks, because non-fractional reserve banking, where you back by currency that's issued, debt that's issued by government into a blockchain asset, you end up with a disruptive force to banking that needs to be managed. Okay. Well, rates are likely at this phase from here. Most people are expecting the rates from the proof of weapons network at the Fed to remain flat from here, because inflation is declining based upon their numbers. And so eventually you expect that to roll over into a quantitative easing cycle. And the justification will be, you are in danger. We all need to fund more war. Otherwise, these evil boogie monsters are all going to come and blow you up. And we all need to hate each other. And the best way to do that is to fund the military industrial complexes and create fear all around. So we end up with war-led quantitative easing, and war is the easiest way of passing legislative changes in a rush, because we're all going to need a digital ID. Then rather than reversing it after the war, you have the digital ID, then a bank gets destabilized. Maybe there's speculative attacks in currency wars. Maybe China implements some of those tactics that we talked about, where they stay out of the war. Remember how America became the power. Britain got blown up during World War I and World War II, and therefore it was completely destabilized and destroyed. Then America didn't get blown up during World War I and II, but they managed to fund it, whereas China could implement a similar strategy. They could fund stuff through their Belt and Road Initiative. They could implement the fact that they have over $4 trillion of American debt. If this gets nasty, and you can see Biden, really warmongering and salivating at the moment, getting everyone ready. He even started talking about, getting American soldiers and Russian soldiers fighting. Check out my Twitter. He's really getting ready. Genocide Joe is getting ready to really really push the violence through and make everyone fearful, so that we can justify this digital ID, and then we can issue the central bank digital currency that blows up the banking system. And rather than you losing your money, you'll buy the drug. And that's really what's happening right now. Now, what I'm going to cover in the second half, let's see how we're doing for time. We're exactly spot on. Wow, I'm getting really good at time. There's a few things that we're going to be doing. Firstly, if anyone's, by the way, it's completely complimentary to join the Bitcoin HardTalk membership portal. In the future, we're going to create a little section, and we emailed everyone today. There's probably not too many questions in there because we just emailed everybody. But we're going to do a segment where you get to ask your questions. In order to ask your questions, you just need to have a login, head over to the section. Here we go. So you head over to simondixon.com, press that blue, not blue, colorblind. Press that yellow button, and that will take you over to the site where you can sign up for the Bitcoin HardTalk membership portal. Enter your details there. We'll send you a free login. And when you're on the inside, you can ask a question, head over there. And we may have some questions already. We just emailed everyone out, so there may not be too many. Just go in the comments section and we'll take some questions for next week. So after this, we'll make sure we do that. And that's where we're going to back up all the archives. And that's where you can get a free digital copy of my book, Bank to the Future. It was the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin and discussed how to protect yourself. There was no such word as central bank digital currencies, but I shared how we would transition to that world. And you can download a copy of the book and everything there. Right. What was I saying? Yeah, so we're going to be doing that in future. We'll start that from next week. Okay, now the second half, and this is a new format, where we'll cover all the Bitcoin and CBDC updates and geopolitics and macro last week in Bitcoin. And then we're going to be tying it into educational content. So in light of what I'm predicting comes next with the Israel-Palestine conflict, is that America, through the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, they have what's known as, I call, a two-tiered system. And so this two-tiered system is where you take an allied force, which is Israel. If you don't know, today, in approximately 3 to 4 hours, we get to see America vote against the rest of the world to continue funding the genocide. It will be the only country, maybe you'll get UK, that will abstain from voting because they're funding a lot of the proof of weapons network across to Israel. And America's going to be voting on that today. And taxpayers are obviously paying over $115 billion in total, $3.5 billion every year, and $14.5 billion is the last application if the bill passes. To get that out, with over 7,000 children blown up already. And that will be voted for today. The rest of the world, the entire world, will vote ceasefire now. And then Israel and America will vote. And America gets a veto because they created United Nations. With the 5 people that can veto, America will probably be the only one in the world that will veto that and go against the world so that ceasefire can't happen. But once it's done, there will be a two-tiered system. The two-tiered system is you take the side that you like and you give them money and you tie it back to your country so that all the money comes back. So you just essentially fund the American industrial complex. That's what happens with all the funding to Israel. But the other side, the ones you don't like, you cripple them with debt so that you can control them. And that's done through the International Monetary Fund and World Bank loans. The difference is, one, you give the money and make them spend it back in your economy. With the International Monetary Fund, you, the economic hitman at the IMF, they lend it to the country, they implement all the conditions, and then they cripple them with dollar debt, where they have to destroy their own currency in order to print, to pay off the bad loans, and all the money ends up back in America. So I'm going to go back to a blog that I created way back in 2009 that describes the flows so you can understand how this whole system works. And remember, it was all created after the change of the world order after World War I, when all of these different agreements came through that we are all experiencing the hangovers from right now. After World War II, you had the territorial breakup of the USSR and the Soviet Union that's led to this NATO Russia proxy war via Ukraine and all the funding that goes in there and then comes back to the States. And then you've had like the territorial wars from the British Empire through Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China, through opium wars and various other things. And that was a hangover from World War II, where the US offered, made a deal with the China Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, which led to that territorial war. And obviously, because they're creating lots of AI chips, that becomes a strategically important region for China when they said they're going to reunify, but they're looking for the right time to do that when America is most likely at its weakest. And obviously, the Balfour Declaration, where the UK colonial empire promised the Zionist movement at the same time as Palestine getting some of the soldiers from the Ottoman Empire to back them against their own people, and from the Cold War and the USSR side, promised both Russia, the Zionist movement, and the Arabs from Palestine that land, and we still have the hangover from it today. That led to a bunch of different wars that led to this territorial expansion and what we are experiencing today. All of those happened during the World War I, World War II, when Britain essentially divided up the Middle East, and America came along when Britain said, we're no longer, at that time, they considered Zionist terrorists at that time because they were blowing up the Brits. And then they had the groups that were creating violence from the Arab side because their land was being stolen. And they said, screw this, we're getting out. And they handed it over to the United Nations. And then United Nations is where America took over with their veto votes. So they get to veto the votes from all of how America, in order to try and make sure that the atrocities that happened during World War I and World War II don't happen again. Now they're using that veto to vote against the world, which could escalate to World War III, which we're trying to protect everyone from. But, as long as you can make everyone scam each other into thinking that the Muslim religions and the Jewish religions are in a fight to obliterate each other, then you end up with this scenario that we are in today, where everyone gets territorial and it just escalates and escalates. And we all start scamming each other on Twitter Spaces to think that we're enemies rather than preaching love, peace, and unity. Anyway, so on the blog, now Bitcoin launched on the 3rd of January, 2029. The white paper was out in 2008, but the first block was mined on the 3rd of January, 2009. The blog that I wrote on the IMF and World Bank was written on the 2nd of February, 2009. On my old website, simondixon.me. And it went through the flow of money. And I'm going to go back to that blog to help you understand it. So the first thing to understand is that all money is created as debt. That was the foundational principle that I tried to bring to the world when I left investment banking in 2006, when I went really deep into reading bank charter acts and wrote my book on this time traveling journey where we changed all. And I remember geeking out on all these different legislations of banking and how we got scammed into handing over the creation of money to the private banking system. And then the Bank of England entered into a deal. And then you had also, the lawyer that funded the Zionist movement also funded the charter for the Federal Reserve in 1913. That Federal Reserve was implemented over Christmas when no one was looking, after a massive constitutional war where monetary reformers like, Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln were in a fight against the central banks to make sure that they don't get taken over by the money printers and the money changers. And so therefore we ended up in this situation. But now, instead of making it illegal to create, money as debt, they legalized it, and central banks became the regulator of ensuring that they could prop up the system based upon taxes. The same year that Federal Reserve came out, they implemented the income tax in order to back up the system and re-divert all money from the people to those that control the money supply. And so money is now created as debt, which is fractional reserve banking. And fractional reserve banking is a misleading term. There is no fraction and there is no reserve. They don't really have to follow it because you can use more financial weapons and mass destruction printed on the proof of weapons network in order to back that. There's no gold behind it. There's no hard money behind it. You just have to create financial weapons of mass destruction and use that in their asset liability reserves. And if you look at a bank balance sheet, if you're as geeky as me, you have this double accounting rule where you have both an asset and a liability simultaneously created to represent client deposits. And that's what creates the issue. And then you can actually back it by government debt, which is printed on the proof of weapon network. And so you have debt on debt on debt on debt. And then fund managers create collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities and insure it by credit default swaps. And then you end up with this craziness that created the 2008 financial crisis where no one can do it. Anyway, money is created as debt. There is more debt in the world than money exists. Every single religious scripture predicted that this is inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed to crash. And every 100 years, we get a new fiat currency empire based upon better monetary policy, but they always blow it up when their colonial expansion and foreign policies get overextended where you can no longer afford to repay. And then the credit rating agencies downgrade your debt. And then you have a large either internal civil revolutionary war or an external war where an enemy comes into your weakness. And nowadays you get cyber war, currency wars that don't necessarily move to military wars, and proxy wars. That's where we are in today. So now the thing to understand is that this creates an environment of what I call export warfare. And so what I was pointing out in this blog is export warfare. What's that? Well, when goods are exported, essentially foreign money enters into your country. So imagine you create something real. You create your Tesla or whatever it is. The world wants to buy it. Then when you're exporting, foreign money comes into your economy. But the debt remains overseas because all money is debt. And so through this, the person that can, or the country rather, not person, the sovereign nation that can export the most goods ends up on the right side of this. And so that's what we've seen in China. They're exporting more goods than anyone else. And through exporting more goods than anyone else, other countries end up with all the debt, and China ends up with the debt-free money as a result of that. So we end up in export warfare, where everyone wants to be a net exporter. But through currency wars and currency manipulation, you can try and make your goods cheaper by controlling your currency. And as long as you are the world reserve currency, you can print excessively more than anyone else. So that's why in the current world order, you have China exporting all those goods and America taking on all that debt, but they can export inflation globally because they have the world reserve currency until they don't. And it always changes. It will change. What's an extreme view is that it won't change because it always does, always has. And you tend to get hard money in the middle. That's where we end up in the Bitcoin equation. Okay. So through exports, the country that receives debt-free money, and debt-free money is good, and you can increase your GDP, and then you get real growth. Money is then converted through the foreign exchange markets, and the debt, if the debt is in a foreign currency, and so that's when you get this money printing in the foreign currency, and it's a bit hard to visualize these things. But you just need to know that people want to export and they want to have the world reserve currency so they can print. That's the current world order that happens every time. Where have we got? Let me get back to my blog. So essentially, the country that exports wins. The country that imports too much, then they will have the largest debt. And so you end up with this symbiotic relationship like China and America has, where China's lending all the money to the US. The US is printing all the money because it has the world reserve currency that everyone wants. And then they have to have this relationship where it's completely destructive to kill the relationship. That kind of regulates the world order. And it works nicely because China doesn't want America to blow up. It wants them to buy their goods. And they also want to lend money. But when it starts to go territorial, they stop wanting to lend. And then you have the disruption that can cause, like we saw with the 2023 bank run crisis. But exports can help an economy more than domestic GDP. This is why, I asked questions when I was first studying economics, like, why the hell would a nation like Africa have all the resources in the world? And I know that the British raped it through inflating their currency and creating the transatlantic slave trade. And by destroying their currency, they were able to replenish their gold supplies that were being mined in Africa. I covered that in previous videos. But why would a country like Africa have all the resources, have people that are starving in their own country, and yet export all their food and export all their goods? Well, it's because of the export warfare, because you can get some debt-free currency and grow your economy. So rather than serving your own people, you serve people abroad, because export warfare drives you into that. And that's exactly why those trends happen, which is crazy, right? So what happened? Well, the World Bank and the IMF were created after World War II. Why were they created? Well, the World Bank was created in order to issue loans to all the countries that were destroyed by the World War. And the IMF was created in order to serve the vision that was created at Bretton Woods 2. As a quick recap, prior to that, we had a gold standard, and that meant that every currency was convertible into gold. So that regulated central banks to stop them excessively printing and destroying their currencies, because it would end up with an outflow of gold to another country. But under the new system, they said, right, the dollar will back its currency by gold, and then everyone else can trade against the dollar. So rather than implementing what John Maynard Keynes was proposing, which was the Bancor world currency, they instead did a US dollar quasi gold-backed reserve, and everyone else could trade. You needed an institution, the IMF, in order to manage the flows and trades of foreign currencies and members of the International Monetary Fund to dollars, and then the gold would be held at Fort Knox, to regulate that system. So that was the 1944 world order in order to recover from World War II. So where does the IMF and the World Bank get their money from? Right. Well, let's start with the World Bank. So remember, the World Bank is lending money in order to fund reconstruction of countries. We now call them the Global South, I guess you could call it. And so they would issue loans, but where would they actually get that money in order to issue the loans? Right, I've gone through the purpose of the IMF, just going through the old blog posts. And you get that rich poor divide. Okay. The other thing to notice is that the purpose of doing these loans is because they're called what's called tied loans. So tied loans is where you issue a loan to a country, but it's tied to the terms and conditions where they have to spend the money back in your country. So this fuels the export warfare. So you can get the money back into your country by exporting your goods to that country, and therefore you have the tied loans. You can also put all your conditions, and you can put in there that you agree to fund, a certain amount of weapons that you'll send there to fund for their military. And you have all these agreements in there, and they often have things like, for example, in Argentina, the agreements is that you have to implement, you have to just tax more and you have to spend less. And so you have these more aggressive political agreements where they push their ideals onto that country in order to, as a condition for the loan. Okay, and the reason for that is because the money is spent back into the economy, and then the country that issued the loan, they end up with all the debt, and they are under the empire of those who issue the loan, control all the power. Remember how the system works. The closer you are to the World Reserve Central Bank, the closer you are to getting on the right side of the proof of weapons network. Okay, so the World Bank, essentially, they issue their money through the bond market. So you can purchase a World Bank bond. Now, who purchases those World Bank bonds? Well, they tend to be fully subscribed by the brokers that sell them. Who are the brokers that sell them? The banks. And so the banks have to have some of their assets in reserve. And so they can put in some of those assets in reserve World Bank bonds. How did banks get the money in order to purchase that World Bank bond? Well, they created it through issuing loans. How did they get the money that they issued the loan? You took it out when you paid the higher interest rate for taking on a mortgage. So you take on a mortgage at a higher interest rate. They get to print that money, and then they get to purchase World Bank bonds as their reserve asset for their bank. So all of that money for the World Bank was created through the fractional reserve system and is completely unsustainable where there's more debt than money. And so while it is backed by assets, World Bank bonds, they're sold to banks, the banks create them, they take out the interest from the system, and it all goes back into the banking system. And if they're a public company, then the money goes back into your pension, and you end up completely in this convoluted way where you are funding the war that you have no idea that you're funding, that can actually purchase the products that inflate away the value of your pension. And that's why you end up having to understand how to buy a Bitcoin ETF in the proof of work network versus the proof of weapons network. And so the original, so that's how the World Bank gets its actual loans, is from banks through money creation. Okay, what about the IMF? Well, in 1979, the IMF, it originally was just almost like a currency broker for those that wanted to convert, but also the members had to deposit gold to back the International Monetary Fund. So you could store your gold, as it were, or you could put a certain amount of your currency or a certain amount of hard money with the International Monetary Fund, and based upon your quota, you're able to do what happened in 1979. In 1979, the International Monetary Fund created its own global digital currency called SDR, special drawing rights. And what it said is every member of the International Monetary Fund, which is like everybody now, they have the equivalent of an overdraft. Now think about your overdraft. When you have a bank account and you go into your overdraft, you don't have the fiat currency there, but you go deeper into money you don't have, and that's money created as debt. So it's a way of issuing debt. But the money you had there, you can draw upon your overdraft. Special drawing rights is where the IMF create this brand new currency, and you can draw upon the SDR, and it's backed by a basket of different currencies and can be repayable through that basket. So members of the International Monetary Fund can draw upon their special drawing rights. But where did the special drawing rights come from? Well, they have to be repaid with just like an overdraft, and the quota countries are kind of used as the reserves for the fractional reserves, but it is money creation. It is created based upon a fraction of the quota reserves, which used to be hard money and can also be different types of assets. How do those assets created? Through the proof of weapons Ponzi scheme. And so you have this ginormous system that we've created today where you have the fiat currency, the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme, I call it, that you have to have central banks to skim out from the system and repurpose all the debt. So the national debt is essentially run up at will by international debt. So people draw upon their overdraft or they borrow. And essentially that puts another country in control of your country. Why? Because you're borrowing in a currency that you can't print. When you borrow in a currency that you can't print, you are at the mercy of the currency and the central bank that you borrow from. Now, US, if they get in a debt-based Ponzi scheme, because more and more people are willing to lend to the US government, they can roll over the Ponzi scheme until no one will purchase it anymore. That's why you end up in a CBDC world. You see where this is going. A CBDC world says the banking system is completely over-leveraged. Let it go bust, and we'll just borrow the bonds and back it by a blockchain asset created on Ethereum like a stable coin. Then you can go direct to finding a new source of issuance, And the way to do that is blow up the banking system once the technology is all ready. People won't lose their deposits and you deleverage it. And that's why you end up with communism on a blockchain where all of your currency has programmatically a digital ID in it and everything you need in it in order to implement programmatic negative interest rates. Money that implodes if you haven't subscribed to a certain school of thought. Money that can be deleted at the will of currency warfare. Money that is completely programmable if you are spending it in a way that they don't want you to spend it. You want to know what that looks like? Look at the central bank digital currency that we already have in China. Coming to a country near you, every single country is already getting ready to launch it right now. They just need the digital ID to get there. And guess what? If it wasn't for the proof of work network, we'd all have to subscribe to the proof of weapons network. But because if you understand how to get ahead of these trends, you can exit the cycle. And that's where Bitcoin comes in. Obviously, gold is a hedge against Bitcoin as well, because if the internet goes down, you want your gold. But if the internet doesn't go down, you got something much superior to gold, where you can spend digitally in quantity without all the restrictions of having to figure out how to store it or store it at a custodian. Okay. All right. Anyway, so these loans, anyway, they're used to buy up assets of the wealthy, from essentially these loans are used to buy up the assets of less wealthy countries. So it's why IMF debt, if you look at Ukraine, for example, fourth largest debtor to the IMF. If you have a NATO vision, which is that you want to expand the NATO mission, which is an alliance to control the expansion of the Soviet Union from the Cold War and the hangovers after World War II, then you lend a bunch of money to Ukraine, you get them completely in debt, and then you tie the loans back to your military complex, which is why, as being a member of NATO, you have to buy a certain amount of weapons. And that's through the tied IMF loan from the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund. And that is how America essentially implemented the colonial expansion, not through land grabs like the British did, but through the International Monetary Fund. Guess who figured out that strategy recently? The IMF, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So China is expanding its empire by saying things like, we'll issue you a loan, but you need to use our 5G network. Our 5G network gives us the data that we want. And America says, hold on, we don't want that. We want you to use our 5G network. We want you to use our artificial intelligence. We want you to use our servers. And we don't want a situation where China can change the narrative through apps like TikTok, because the algorithm can actually show some of the atrocities that are happening in America funding genocide at the moment in Palestine. We don't want China to be able to put that algorithm. We want to control the media, and we want to make sure that we do that. And so why does Elon privatize Twitter? So we are able to have some level of freedom of speech, meant to be the freedom of speech platform. Then you end up in Elon and the powers that be arguing because they claim he's an anti-Semite or whatever it may be. And you end up in the exact debate that's happening around the world right now. And so just to be clear, supporting or believing that genocide shouldn't happen in Palestine from the sins of the Brits that were making my people is not anti-Semite. My father is Christian. My mother is Jewish. My family and I subscribe to Islam. I don't have any of those things, but these are the types of things that are happening when you stand up to oppression. And so tying that all together, this is all happening because we are all stuck in export warfare, currency warfare from the proof of weapons network. And in order to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme, we all have to believe, and we're all driven against each other, that the governments that get in the way of this, because they're all engaged in export warfare, that we all need to blow each other up in order to roll over the world's largest regulated debt-based Ponzi scheme. We have all been scammed And in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto gave a gift from repurposing electricity into the proof of weapons, into the proof of work network that allowed us to exit the traditional financial system, the role that gold always played, but allowed it to do it digitally, globally, through the largest network of decentralized computers around the world that is getting stronger and stronger and stronger through every 4-year cycle. And so that is going to do it for episode 14 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. What I'd love for you to do is head over to simondixon.com, create your account on the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And we've sent you a link if you're on our list, and we'll send you another link later in our list. And you can actually put in the membership site what you would like me to cover in the second segment of future Bitcoin Hard Talk episodes. I'm going to always do last week in Bitcoin and CBDC world for the first half, and the second half we'll do educational content like IMF and export warfare. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting times in financial history. Many are going to get wrecked on the wrong side of the cycle. Others are going to do really well. And I want to make sure that you are on the right side of that change. And every time we're scammed into thinking that me and you don't have peace, don't have love, and don't have unity because of the proof of weapons network and our debt position and whatever we're in, and we're scammed into thinking we need to fight each other, always remember that we can do this with peace, love, and unity. And when you exit the proof of weapons network, you can enter into a much safer place of peace if you play the 4-year cycle right. And in future videos, I want to make sure that you understand how to balance that between managing your expenses and the proof of weapons network, managing your savings investments. And next year in February, we're going to kick off our annual Wealth Builder program as well. And I look forward to sharing with you so that you can make sure that you are on the right side of that change. So I'll see you next week, this time, same time. And I'd love to hear your comments in the membership portal of what you'd like me to cover next week. And leave a comment below as well if you're watching this on YouTube. We'll back it up in case we end up getting banned because we speak too much of what I believe to be the truth. And by the way, if I end up saying something that ends up to be wrong, I'll correct it because I'm committed to the truth. No matter how painful it is, no matter how bad it is, I'll make sure that I'm always trying to commit to sharing that with you on this financial journey. And I'll see you this time next week. Peace.